Welcome to the Supply Chain Pioneers podcast, where we highlight industry leaders on the forefront of innovation and technology in planning, procurement, and logistics. Hosted by your supply chain pro to know, Ulf Venn.
But at the end of the day, a company has two main goals, and the supply chain is such an essential activity to deliver on these goals. So the key to an effective and efficient supply chain risk program is to strike that balance between the risk investment and the desired performance. My career kind of spans 3 decades in the field. And I also worked with the World Economic Forum and a variety of government agencies. I felt so passionately about this need to address these reoccurring issues, I even wrote a few books.
Supply Chain Pioneers is powered by Everstream Analytics. Everstream gives you the predictive insights and analytics to make your supply chain faster, smarter, safer, and leaner. Go to everstream.ai to book your demo today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Supply Chain Pioneers. And with me today, I have Gary Lynch, and he is the founder of The Uncertainty Advantage. He's a board member, an advisor, and he's also an author. Hi, Gary. How are you?
I'm doing well today. Thanks, Hope.
Good. And we will talk today about all of your projects and your great experience you have in supply chain risk management and in risk management in general. So
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks.
Perfect. Let's hop right into it with my first question that directly, hopefully, will help introduce a little bit the person that you are. So from cybersecurity to risk and security to supply chain risk management, what made you double down on supply chain risk management? Because you have a lot of experience in all of these fields.
Yeah, that's a great question. I did take a while to reflect on that as well, because I've made a bunch of changes starting in the cyberspace. But at the end of the day, a company has two main goals when I look at a company. And the supply chain is such an essential activity to deliver on these goals. And the company must, at the end of the day, get the product to the customer while balancing it with the desired profitability. In other words, not go broke doing it. And the reality is, in this uncertain and volatile world we live in, it threatens the organization's ability to do both of these things successfully. So the key to an effective and efficient supply chain risk program is to strike that balance between the risk investment and the desired performance. And that's been my personal challenge as well. My career kind of spans 3 decades in the field. In the early years, I focused on defensive activities like risk analysis, risk measurement, risk mitigation, firefighting, and evangelizing fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's an event-driven industry. That's where I spent my time. But then I had a chance. I worked as an executive partnering with leaders from Fortune 500 companies like NVIDIA, BAE Systems, Otsuka Pharmaceutical, Pepsi, Roche, Westinghouse Nuclear, and others. And I also worked with the World Economic Forum and a variety of government agencies. But I consistently saw the same supply chain risk issues cropping up, impacting customers, patients, investors, and the bottom line. So, Ulf, I felt so passionately about this need to address these reoccurring issues. I even wrote a few books: Single Point of Failure, Uncertainty Advantage, At Your Own Risk. And I changed my career focus from a practitioner to a consultant to an industry analyst, and then to a practitioner again, back to a consultant. And I spent time as an entrepreneur, which was the most fun. So in 2015, I took some time off to delve further into the research and try to address some of these critical questions, these unanswered questions that executives and leaders have been asking. Like, why can't leaders get the supply chain intelligence they need to make critical decisions in disruptive times? Why, in many instances, don't leaders and managers acknowledge and act on risk intelligence? And why is it so difficult to get their attention sometimes? We talk about the seat at the table. And why are so many organizations focusing on compliance rather than thriving or exploiting the value of risk intelligence and the investment? So bottom line is, I quickly realized I was onto something, because there continued to be no comprehensive solution or the ability to measure return on the horizon. So I was sitting there with all these tried and true methodologies, data, technologies that I had helped build throughout my career. I knew I could help these leaders on a greater scale, and then finally help the leaders tackle supply chain risk head on and turn it into competitive advantage. And then lastly, I also believed I can create a value and scalable business commercialize it from those experiences, and hey, make some money at it as well.
While doing all of what you just described, you were also a founding member of the advisor committee on supply chain competitiveness by the United States Secretary of Commerce. And you also received a US Secret Service commendation for your action during 9/11. What makes US supply chain stay competitive in the global economy? And what advice would you give US supply chains in order for them to keep their competitive edge?
I think that's a really good question. I'll try to take that kind of head on from a US perspective, but I'll also touch on some of the experiences I've had in some other countries, in Japan and Germany, especially, where there was certainly a uniqueness to the way that end products were delivered to customers, especially when you deliver in heavy machinery and things like that too. So first and foremost, I think what helped US-based supply chains stay competitive is a clear understanding of market priorities, acting with urgency, relentless firefighting, and a positive mindset, like nothing is too dire, we can overcome everything, even though sometimes that's very dangerous. And lately, I think the differentiator for these organizations, both the US and abroad, have been the understanding of interdependency amongst assets in the supply chain. First, kind of the top priority is that market perspective, an outside in, and that's what I described in uncertainty advantage. This can be the products and services that generate the most revenue for the company. It could be the most important from a strategic value standpoint or a cash flow standpoint, or what's critical to protect the health and safety of their patients, of the community, of the market. However, the challenge is always to get everybody to agree and and then clearly articulate the policy or what they see as the priority to their stakeholders. And for me, this became the rallying point and really the energy behind really my interest in pursuing the field the way I'm pursuing it now from this so-called competitive advantage standpoint. It's the rallying point. It's the benchmark for measurement. And without it, you have inefficient processes, technologies, and behaviors, and quite frankly, organizational chaos. So whenever we start with the conversation, whether it be for the Department of Commerce or for an organization, we refer to these as kind of the rallying points as these high-value supply chain. Very obvious when you say it like that. It's like what matters most, but how you define it and quantify it and really get the attention of the executives and the market leaders is what's most important. So that's a starting point. It provides strategic focus. It unifies the functional silos, which we all kind of are challenged with when you are design and install a solution. And you have to work through procurement, logistics, and commercial manufacturing. And then, of course, all the other external partners, internal partners from the corporate standpoint. This is kind of that rallying point. And it's happened with all those companies I mentioned before, NVIDIA and Westinghouse and Rockwell. It was really, in the life sciences industry, it's pretty straightforward. It's the franchise drugs, the blockbuster drugs. But the key there is not only is it the rallying point, it gives you an opportunity to measure return on risk invested capital. And I think that's the differentiation that gets the executives engaged. But it's not an easy task to measure that. When staying competitive, I think, that's pretty much straightforward, and that gives you the context and ultimately the fit. And of course, it's always about the ability to continuously collect, organize, analyze, and monitor your supply chain and supply chain risk data at a granular level. And this was really key with the committee as well, so that you can generate the intelligence to make responsive and informed decisions. You'll need digitalization and a connected model. I'm not a big fan of control towers, honestly. I just think they're too big and generic, and trying to fit all the data into it is tough. I think the connected data model is the way to go, and what I call an activity model, which really represents the operational flows and processes. Turning that and digitizing that, to me, are the two key elements there, and that's mostly what I've tried to persuade others and work with others to figure out if that's right. And I think one of the most important points is whatever you do, it has to be very, very simplified. The questions that are being asked by the folks that are asking the committee to address some of these items are pretty straightforward. They want them to provide some discussion on, will they be disrupted? Do they need to take action? How fast do they need to take action? What resources and activities are required? And what's the opportunity? And then Another issue, and I'll kind of wrap it up here, but another issue is that, companies are dealing with this cost and effort of monitoring the supply chain for disruptive events. And organizations and governments are doing the same thing. And it's great news that everybody has been investing in event monitoring software. In my opinion, the bad news is they're not fully committing to a risk mitigation investment. They're digitizing, maintaining, and monitoring the supply chain data. That's a risk mitigation effort, which I would refer to as kind of producing information. And so, like business intelligence, in order to do that, requires the support, the full support, which requires the infrastructure to support the detection and the filtering and the escalation. And honestly, that's kind of, here's a little plug, that's kind of the spot that, Uncertainty Advantage is trying to fit in, is to do that on their behalf, especially for small to mid-sized companies and companies in the drug industry. You need to really have actionable advice that gets down to an operational level that affects, so they can see the effect to inventory, capacity, forecasting, and things like that. So I think, the readiness and the ability to measure the impact on operations and having the best action to respond are also vital to kind of capitalizing on this change. It's not a one size fits all, right? And it doesn't all happen at once. So it's kind of an iterative process as well.
Quick follow-up question, because I was very surprised about your take on Control Tower, which I can understand, by the way, in part. But another guest on this podcast once said, if you ask 10 people about their definition on Control Towers, you get 10 different answers. So is it that maybe the way Control Towers are built right now are just too broad in scope, and therefore it gets too clunky? And wouldn't more, I would call it crawl, walk, run approach, where you stay a little bit more agile in implementation, and maybe start with risk management as being one of the focus points, right? Because it helps provide focus. Firefighting logistics issues is something that feels natural to supply chains. Wouldn't that already work, or is that something that you're really against, even if described like that?
Well, yeah, when somebody makes a statement like I just made about Control Towers, you always have to not refine it, but you always have to clarify why you are saying what you're saying. So you're asking a good question. My question, my response really has to do with the experience I've had, and specifically, as far as Control Tower being maybe an end-all solution at some point in the future, maybe. But at this point, I think it's just too early. I still think that a lot of executives and leaders and managers are starting to really digest what risk management means, what the investment means, how they can slowly, bring commonality together. I mean, if you're doing a risk assessment, or if you're looking at your high value supply chains, the products that matter to you most, maybe you can think about some of the common aspects of cyber assessment and supply chain assessment and supplier assessment, and that all makes sense. Again, I'm talking from a risk standpoint, but the reality is you have to kind of I think from my standpoint is the behaviors you have to analyze at the same time. And because we're still rewarding functional behavior in most instances, there's a lot of lip service to rewarding, the whole, right? But when it comes down to it, and someone gets their bonus at the end of the year, or a group gets their bonus based on a certain amount of cost reduction or a certain amount of progress against something, it's really hard to get them to rally on a common denominator unless they're rewarded on that common denominator. And that's where I've seen the struggles in most of the organizations I've worked in.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting point.
Yeah, so maybe later, not sooner. But the connected data strategy, I like that because it allows you to really start moving right away and provide some reward. And, okay, so this isn't a plug, but I'm going to use it as a plug. This is something that I've successfully done and I'm doing right now, is being able to take some of the data, the alerts, the supply chain data, the risk profile and assessment data, some of the market data, connect it all, and then be able to give a much better business intelligence.
Let's move on to another topic, one that I really am super curious about, because you are a legend in this space, because you wrote several books on risk management and supply chain risk management, from the uncertainty advantage to single point of failure and at your own risk, which all were mentioned already, but also you co-authored supply chain disruptions. So for today, because we can't do all of them, but I would like to talk about two of those. And let's start with single point of failure. There you elaborated on the 10 essential laws of supply chain risk management. Can you maybe share your top 3 out of these 10 with us today on the podcast?
Yes, I can. I'll take the 2 and I'll try to make them somewhat brief as well. That was a fun journey, single point of failure, because single point of failure was when I had that complete mindset about playing defense, and that I finally felt by working as a practitioner, then a market analyst and an industry consultant, then moving over to the risk and insurance space and looking at it through a finance lens, that I had like a 360 lens. And I worked for a company in that time, Marsh & McLennan, that had a global presence, and I got to work with all these great companies. And I thought, okay, now the solution is, let's get to that point where we really can look at this thing from a defensive posture and a balance, as I mentioned early on, with the trade-off between risk and performance. And it led me down a certain path, which changed later on, which uncertainty advantage was more on the competitive side, but that's where it started. So I guess the one thing, the 2 laws that stand out for me was law number 4, demand trumps supply. I think we learned this during COVID. Most of the organizations focused on the supply side, right? Many didn't take the time to model scenarios, interdependencies, and behaviors when there was a shock to demand, case in point, toilet paper, and look at really the issue around supply chains and human behavior when the element of scarcity is introduced, or the subject of scarcity, or even just some fear is introduced, which can also be used as a competitive weapon or distraction. So what happens is we've seen the human behaviors being amplified on the demand side. And so the characteristics are that the forecast that gets thrown out the window, everything becomes irrelevant, and because you're dealing with 3 behaviors. And I think these 3 behaviors are really good for your what if scenarios. And they are, what are the hoarders going to do? What are the speculators going to do? Those that can potentially make some money on the ambiguity at that time. And what are the panic buyers going to do? And I think it's that simple, trying to keep it that simple. So one number, I think it was 4, was one of my favorites. Another one was never set up your suppliers for failure. And when I wrote the book and did the research, it took on a different meaning than it does today, in my opinion. In the past, it was always, know your downstream supplier or your upstream suppliers. Obviously, it's not optional, it's mandatory. And you have to go beyond that. And of course, you've got to look at that from multiple programs, including diversity, slavery, and a lot of other issues that we deal with in the trust area. And of course, the old adage of trust but verify still stands strong. You can really depend on these other companies, as you're doing, to manage. I don't think you can depend on these companies to manage risk at the end of the day, right? They're custodians, and their business models really drive how they're going to behave. And I think that's the one thing that I've just spent a lot of time on the last decade, is trying to understand that, like even the term resilience. Resilience in the airline industry, if you run an airline, resilience is a given. It's not that you want to bounce back. In fact, you want to have perfection, because you don't want 98 out of 100 flights, successful and 2 not, right? So the term gets a little diluted when you move from industry to industry, but ultimately your suppliers and your contractors and your distributors, they're accountable, but they're not accountable, right? You are accountable to your customers and investors. And honestly, when I started to look at this, I had to go back in time, and I went back to my Michael Porter books on competitive advantage and competitive strategy. And I looked at 5 forces and, really started to re-understand the application of that as it applies to risk. So understanding the structure of your supplier's industry and the business that they operate, their financial, operational, and market drivers, and the broader ecosystem now becomes the ante or the mandatory requirement when you're dealing with a particular industry. Case in point, I mentioned it in the book, was the melamine crisis, when we had all the milk powder contamination. We had brokers kind of in the middle of the flows tainting the milk with melamine in order to raise the protein content. But if you look at the industry structure, you had, single farmers in China, for the most case, had a cow or two. They were the contributors to the early part of the supply chain. The cows were unhealthy at that point in time. In fact, I found out afterwards that their partner, Fonterra, and not to mention names, but in New Zealand, because they were very aggressive in fixing the problem. When they discovered the problem and they wanted to continue the business, at the time, they started exporting cows from New Zealand, which is, the capital of the dairy product, and moving it to China. Again, understanding the ecosystem, the longer value chain, and then having the support in being able to not only, track it down and track the flows, but being able to digitize it, being able to put it into visuals. That has been huge from our standpoint, and probably the greatest contribution. So although I love the rule or the law when I set it up originally about suppliers, it's kind of taken on a new meaning. And it's more about the business and knowing how money is made, who wields the power and the influence, who has the leverage. And that includes the foreign governments and trade policy. Case in point, what everybody's kind of dealing with from a U.S. perspective regarding China as an example. So this becomes the critical point.
Let's move to your next book, which is The Uncertainty Advantage. And in the book, you talk a lot about the 5 principles of uncertainty advantage. And they are really cornerstones. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on these 5 principles and how they can be leveraged.
Honestly, when I started the book, again, I was an entrepreneur at the time. I decided to change the career focus again. And I really wanted to work on this book because I had been through a number of experiences about creating value and having the value then being recognized at different levels in the organization. And in this case, all that supply chain data and intelligence was creating value. And it wasn't creating value just for operations and legal and other areas. It was creating value for the CEO, for the market, for differentiation. So I had to explore this further. And so what I did is I decided I was going to write the book and kind of keep the business going. And I did that for my budgeted year. And as it turned out, a year went by and I was very unhappy. I had ripped the manuscript up 3 or 4 times because I just wasn't happy. I didn't think I was saying anything of value. And so as a desperate move, and as things got tighter, I decided to reach out through LinkedIn to 10 CEOs who had experienced major disruptions and had come out of it in a very positive way. Oddly enough, I did this through an in-mail. Oddly enough, 9 of them came back and responded and said they'd give me the time to explain the situation. And so I tried to document those. There's 16, 17 case studies in the book. Hopefully, you shorten them in a book and you try to get to the salient points quickly. That for me was the fun part. And one gentleman, John Krafik, who I have a great deal of respect for, he was running Hyundai at the time, North America, and went over to Google and basically ran Waymo for a while. He had some just absolutely super comments about this whole idea of being market focused as opposed to operationally or financial focused. So that's a little bit of the background on the book. So the cornerstone, I think the 5 uncertainty advantage principles are the following. First of all, it was focus. What I saw was that quest for market advantage kept them up at night. The leadership team, yes, they care about operational disruptions, but that's also, they have a team of folks to work on that. But what they want to know is the market changing? Is the market moving? Or am I going to be displaced in the market because of this particular event? What are the market dynamics? Again, for the what if scenario, what are the market dynamics if I'm no longer in the market or my competitor is no longer in the market? And this is something that the risk professionals can help with. And these are some of the lessons from some of the senior leaders, I think, that have had great success as well. So, organizations are rewarded for taking risks, and they're always pushing the envelope. That's not going to change. So that's accepted, and you have to build your strategy around that. So it's important, or it's imperative, that we understand the expectations of the market first, and all the risk mitigation activities will follow. So that was kind of the leading principle. The other one also took me back in time, and it was navigation. And I honestly was guilty for the same problem. Manage risk, navigate uncertainty. There is a difference. And I know these are the holy wars here when you bring up this issue of what's the difference between risk and uncertainty. But I'm going to just use a definition that I really enjoy. Uncertainty represents the unknown, and it requires the essential elements of risk management, which we previously discussed: insight and intelligence. You need to produce data, but you need to have enough intelligence about the uncertainty in order to get to that point where you can model and measure the probability of a possible outcome, where you think something's going to happen. So before you can start getting really into the mechanics of risk management, you first have to produce the data, like we've been talking about since the beginning of the podcast, right? So here's the odd thing about this. In the middle of my research, I realized that one of the speakers, I think, that was pretty dominant in the 1920s, a guy named Frank Knight, who was an economist for the University of Chicago, wrote a book called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. And it talked about uncertainty and the transformation of uncertainty to risk and how to change it into profit and how to look at it through a competitive advantage. Frank Knight educated people like economists like Milton Friedman and others. And a disciple of Milton Friedman and some of these other economists was a gentleman who was running risk for a bank, Bankers Trust, which was a competitive bank to the one I was working for at the time, which was Chase Manhattan Bank. But we followed the same operational risk management principles. And Charles Sanford, I believe was his name, started the concept of derivatives. So Bankers Trust, introduced the derivative instruments. If I had it correct, I'm probably sure that there's going to be a lot of folks that will say I had it incorrect, but this is what I found in my risk inquiry. And so my point is, if you think about it in that context and you separate the uncertainty from the risk, you realize you can't manage uncertainty. You have to get the intelligence and you have to navigate it, and you have to keep getting the intelligence until you get to the point where you get to that tipping point of being able to manage risk. So that was my favorite second principle. This third, I think, was the most obvious, but was not acknowledged. And that was markets move fast, but organizations don't. So getting things done, as we all know, in big organizations is very hard. I think static risk programs are ineffective and costly. I mean, I hate to say it because that's where I grew up, and it's great to have the risk programs, but how do you go about defining a continuity risk program when there's so many moving parts internally and externally, and you don't have control over so many of those moving parts, including your suppliers? Back to the 5 forces: competitors, suppliers, displacement. I mean, did Western Digital have the ability way back when we had the floods in Thailand to bring back the hard drive industry in its current state, with the technology that was being produced then? Not really. However, they were smart enough to realize maybe that was a great entry point to bring solid state drives onto the market. They had been experimenting, bringing it forward. And so Seagate too, they all kind of jumped on it. So I think that was, one of the challenges, I think, with static programs and transitioning away from static programs. And the need to produce continuous intelligence and then capture it into a digital replica was critical, was the critical element. And honestly, as a consultant, when I was doing the consulting, it was like, come analyze our systems, analyze our suppliers, and you do the analysis, and then they call you back a year later and say, hey, can you come in and do the analysis again? And it's like, why don't we retain this footprint? Why don't we retain this is the change management function now, right? But now we're getting there, and thankfully, platforms like the one you're very familiar with are good platforms to start with because you have some place to put it and some place where you can look at it through a change management lens. They're mature and they capture all elements of it. So the other ones is details, the devil's in the details, and this demands relentless pursuit. And again, I would organize that in the context of the way the business is conducted and what makes money. Honestly, when I look at a product supply chain, I look at that product supply chain end to end. I look at it through the lens of physical assets, digital assets, human capital, and third parties. And I use that as kind of my common denominator. Now, the company or organization I'm working with might not want to pursue all those at once. They might want to do it over time, but I got to be able to capture all that because that's what's needed. Those are the contributors to make that supply chain move. And then the last one is a priority. Growth trumps risk. Let's never forget that. Risk management must demonstrate value, but the reality is, if there's an opportunity to make money, we know what's going to happen. And sometimes, even if they have to break the rules or bend the rules, I'm sorry, just speaking from reality and experience, they'll find a way.
And it's necessary as well, right? Because in the end, we all, as companies, have to grow. because that's just the world we're living in. And
the pressure.
Therefore, accepting risk can also be an option. Okay, so I really love that you shared with us the origin story of the Uncertainty Advantage, a book, because my next question is around your company, the Uncertainty Advantage, and the origin story, because you recently in this year founded the Uncertainty Advantage as a company. And I would be very curious to hear more about the reasoning and also your vision of this company now and for the future.
I mentioned, I've had a long career. That could be a positive or a negative, as long as you continue to keep your mind open and continue to learn, because there are better ways to do it than some of us believe. Over time, but that's the key. But I still see this desperate need for actionable intelligence, and I think, honestly, the last couple of years, post pandemic, to me, this has been the biggest change in the industry right now. This whole fear, uncertainty, and doubt selling we were talking about earlier, we don't have to do it as much anymore. The leaders want solutions. They want actionable intelligence, not just intelligence. And I think, from my perspective, that's where I believe the great opportunity is. And there's a huge opportunity for all those in the field to take, at a base level first. You need that ability, put everything else aside, you need that ability to monitor events and fight fires. You just, it's reactionary, but it's going to lead you to preventative measures, but you have to start somewhere. And we are always in the business of having to justify our value, right? So, a return on risk invested capital. So for me, this was the desperate need and the change, this need for actionable intelligence, not just actionable and not just intelligence, but actionable intelligence. So don't tell me, I just have an event. You got to take it to the next level, and you got to tell me how it's ultimately going to impact my customers and how it's going to impact profitability, the two things I opened up with. And that's a long journey. And that's a journey that you're going to take with a variety of people in the organization over time. But ultimately, if you keep focused on that goal, I thought that would be the greatest opportunity. And it's even for right now, I've been focusing on the life science industries. It's very, very hard, especially when you're running in parallel. You're running an organization to drive new medicines and new therapies into the market, new medical devices, new biotechnologies, the CAR T and some of the other advancements. And then you have to think about this problem and everything that's used to support it. And you have to think about, in that industry, quality kind of trumps everything else. If you don't have stability, you don't have quality. So again, I think leaders are looking for folks like us, the collective us, and those hopefully on the call as well, to not only give them intelligence, but as we say, simple intelligence with visuals, simplicity, relevancy, which we've all been striving for, is making sense out of the intelligence that they're getting. In other words, getting that uncertainty and defining it. And then what do they do about it? And quite a few organizations and leaders have come to me and said, just give me my 3 options and tell me what happens if I don't do it. And if you kind of think that simplistically, you can design your solutions around that. So that's kind of led to Uncertainty Advantage. I went through over a year trying to come up with a name for this new organization while I was building it. And a dear colleague of mine came to me and said, Gary, what are you wasting all your money doing that for? Why don't you just call it Uncertainty Advantage? You wrote a book on it. Just call the name Uncertainty Advantage. So another lesson learned, right? So that's kind of where I stand. And, like I said, when I spoke to John Krafik and some others about the challenge, they demonstrated, I just love that story about we had the tsunami and the earthquake in Japan, the unfortunate events. I love the story about Merck, the paint. They had a paint factory there that was producing Xerolec, and it had been affected, so it was out. And as a result, the paint pigment wasn't available in the market. So what happened? The dealers and the customers, providers, the OEMs said, the car companies said, you can't have a red or a black car. However, if you think about it, and this is what they did, they identified that this was a single source of a material they relied on, the bill of materials. This was a single provider, single source, single site, and they did the what if scenario. And they had gone through and said, okay, if this does disappear, we're not going to be able to get any capacity out of the market because the big three are going to get all the capacity, what's left in the market, the allocation. So why don't we start to design a solution for alternative colors? And I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it was an alternate to Xerolic. And you go through the Evonik disaster, right, with DuPont, the alternative solution there back with the explosion and the Evonik facility. Same thing. And here's the result, though, is Hyundai was able to cut over to a new supplier in 5 weeks. The other OEMs, it took 5 months for them to cut over, just from some planning around single and sole sourcing. To me, that was like, bingo, I want to be in this field, and this is where I'm going to spend my time and money.
I remember that quite a bit. And all of a sudden, everybody in Germany was driving white cars because it got modern. That's how the trend started, actually. You have done this now for more than 30 years, a long, long time.
I started when I was 7 years old.
No, it's quite an awesome journey. And as we can see here on the podcast, you still have a lot of passion for the topic of risk and supply chain risk management. So how is it that you continuously first reinvent yourself, and then also how can you keep your passion ongoing to even start a new company this year? That's amazing.
Look, executives still have problems, leaders have problems, the managers, the people I'm talking to still have these problems. And, I'm in the business of solving problems. I'm a firefighter. I put out fires. That's what I do. But I'd like to get out there in front of those fires. And honestly, to me, it's so much better now because there's such a network, a support network, people like yourself, organization like yourselves, the universities, the colleagues and the friends you've made over the years in countries like, the Philippines and Singapore and Australia and Germany, et cetera. We're finally getting our act together, and it's great because we're learning from one another. And I don't want to miss that. I think that's a great opportunity. I like being a sponge.
Okay, let's switch topics. You not only want to be a sponge yourself and work with universities, but you literally are working in universities as a teacher, and you lecture graduate students at the MIT and other universities. So what is the reception of the students that you interface with to the topic of risk management?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's kind of good news and bad news there. The students themselves, or in this case, using the word student is really not even the right word. Some of them, they're very, very successful executives that are in these programs. They were intrigued. They wanted to pursue the topic and the career further. They thought they had, in many cases, something to contribute. However, for the most part, and that's the bad news, the profession hadn't matured or developed yet. And I think we're still kind of in our infancy. You have, areas like property, being in the insurance business, right? You have property engineers, and, they were kind of breaking out. But unfortunately, because they were doing placement for business interruption insurance and areas like that, they were only looking at a certain type of assets. And going back to our early discussion, when the drug doesn't get to the patient, do you care that the asset failed was asset, a physical asset or inventory, or it was somebody that didn't show up to work today, So I think the challenge was, and this is the good and bad news, there were no full-time positions, there were no programs out there, only consulting opportunities, and that was a little undefined as well. And it requires, what they liked about it is it required a diverse set of skills. We were bringing over some folks from University of Maryland, from the Smith School, where I'm a senior research fellow. And there's a great gentleman over there who's since retired, but still very active, Sandy Boyson. And he was helping us bring some folks over to Marsh at the time. And it was great because they loved it, because you needed management consulting experience, engineering experience, financial management experience. You got really kind of exposed to operational management, risk management. So I'm hoping that this is the journey forward, and I hope we can accelerate the development, but we need more programs. We need more programs that tie into, and not stand alone, they tie into operational management programs and financial management programs and technology. Artificial intelligence is, we talk a lot about that. Well, how does it apply to our problem? I think, again, there needs to be some focused programs on that kind of support this career track, because now it really is a career track.
What do you think the future will hold for supply chain risk management?
Well, I think the future, this is a paradox. The future is very bright. We're going to have more disasters. They're going to accelerate the magnitude. And I don't mean to laugh, but the reality is, right, it's not going away. It's getting worse. And whether we're looking at climate or slavery or whatever topic you want to pick, unfortunately, a lot of them are moving in the wrong direction. But the good thing is that folks are working to try to solve some of these. So I think there will be increased pressure from the stakeholders, from key stakeholders, business partners and boards. And the deeper insight will be needed, and it will be needed in the context of the way the business operates and what they can afford, aka the trade-off, right, between risk and performance, and risk and your expectations of your clients. And they're going to need the ability to interrogate and model risk, which I think is just beginning now. And I mean model beyond what they do in the insurance industry from a Nat Cat standpoint and things like that. But really look at those what if scenarios, failure at distribution points or other nodes, or they do it already for operational processes and logistics management. Why can't we just extend it to the bigger scenarios, right? And I think it's also, the future holds a lot in terms of AI and generative AI and machine learning and we've touched on this, but I do think we're in its infancy. And I don't mean necessarily just the technology, but just in applying it. I saw some studies, where only 5% of the leaders are actually applying it and all that. We've seen that with the internet and everything. We've lived through a lot of those trends, and I think we've got a long way to go. But honestly, I mean, who wouldn't, when you're starting to look at, like in my case, I'm tracking and trending some supply chains. If I'm looking at magnesium stearate, I go out to the AI right there and I start there, because it gives me a nice description as to what is needed to go into that material, who participates. I got to go out and validate all that, but it's a starting point, right? So the more we can automate that, it's big. And I think the big thing on the modeling side will be the organization's going to really need to measure the impact of nodal failure or node failure, correlated failures, and systemic failures, and then generate the intelligence to prescribe clear actions. Again, simple intelligence to describe the options and actions and really kind of capitalize on this disruption.
It's only going to get more unstable, more people are needed. It's not perfect, but it is what it is, right? We have to accept reality, move on, and just do what needs to be done. And that's, I think, also the fun part of working in supply chain. It's very pragmatic.
It is, and it's pragmatic, right? And every day we just, I don't know about you, but I get up in the morning and I'll get up at 5 o'clock, and the first thing I'll do is I'll start scanning the alerts. I'll start scanning the news. I'll start it kind of keeps you in touch with the world and how things are changing and how things, more importantly, are linked up. And if you like puzzles and linkages, this is the field to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Okay, to my last question. You are not only an icon in supply chain risk management, but also a voluntary firefighter, department officer there, and an OEM coordinator. Why are risk managers always also firefighters?
Yeah, you got that right. Yes, we're firefighters. Firefighting is always risk management, and risk management is always firefighting. So, but here's what they have in common. I think there's 4 things they have in common. First of all, I think the most important thing as a firefighter, and doing that for many decades, is situational awareness. To acknowledge that every situation is unique. There is uniqueness. You cannot apply a one-size-fits-all. But of course, that gets to the second one, which says both of them require a lot of pre-planning. The essential element in the understanding of the environment you're operating in. In the firefighting world, you've got to know building construction, you've got to know responses and where your hydrants are, and search and rescue procedures and ventilation procedures and timing, which we didn't talk about, but is huge in the supply chain risk profession. Pre-planning is essential. And just one note on timing. That's the other thing I think that's changed in the profession as well, is that timing is now acknowledged and recognized for a lot of people. And I think it's important because, I mean, you get an alert that a port is down, and that's really good if you have some critical materials going through. But if your materials already passed through and are being staged for next year's run, and you have 6 months to wait, right? So, I mean, this is all common sense, but right, we overlook it because we're trying to do so much. And so the third principle, going back to the commonality, is continuous monitoring and rapid response. The first few minutes, the hours, the first few days of any event are the most critical for suppression, for getting the right intelligence, validating the intelligence, getting it to the right people. We're not the right people in most cases to make the decision. Our job in the risk profession is to get that intelligence, the options, and the understanding to the right people that are running the critical parts of the business. So sometimes there could be some confusion in the lines on that. The same is true with firefighting. When you don't have the big picture and you're inside suppressing the fire, you shouldn't be given orders for other parts of the operation, including ventilation. That's up to the operational command as well as the overall command. And the fourth commonality is training. Training. And that includes training for the worst, because you're going to need much less 98% of the time. But when you have to make that rescue or that grab, or you have that critical event, where your warehouse is taken out by a tornado, you better have that information that says, here's how it's going to affect my business. Here's how it's going to affect my customers. And this happened a couple of years ago. We were in a time where there was a shortage of aluminum for foil that's used on packaging. You got to know those things. So somebody's got to get that intelligence to the right people. So training is everything.
As a voluntary firefighter in the past myself, I can't agree more. So,
oh, you are?
Yeah. Actually,
oh, fantastic. Well, brothers in arms.
I actually won an award once for Youth Firefighter, Best Youth Firefighter Team in Bavaria. We scored 4th place out of 150. So,
oh, congratulations!
Yeah,
congratulations!
It was big.
Well, one thing about firefighting, and I hope risk management, becomes like this too. We're diversified, fully diversified, quite frankly, in the volunteer service. And I'm sure you see the same thing. We don't really care where you come from, what you do, what your background is, who you are. You once you join, you're part of the brother and sisterhood. And that's the beautiful thing about it, is that you become a giant family and you watch out, and nobody goes home alone. And, everybody gets home is kind of our motto. And I think, when we deal with risk management, I think that unification of the forces is one of the essential elements, because you're trying to get intelligence, and you can't get intelligence of just the little picture. You have to get intelligence of all the linkages in the big picture, and you're going to rely on other people for that. So, and that can get competitive at times. I've got one organization that I was dealing with who we was producing alerts for them, event alerts, and we got that right, and we started giving them actionable intelligence, and all of a sudden one part of the organization said, you know what, I don't think we should distribute this to this group over here. I think we should just keep it within this group, and it wasn't for security reasons.
Yeah.
So, but that's the reality. I mean, if you don't acknowledge behaviors and adapt to the behaviors, you're going to fail, period. It may take you a long time, but you're going to fail.
Absolutely. So we ran through the questions. Thank you so much, Gary. I personally learned a lot about you and also your books again. They are great, by the way. I really recommend everybody checking those out. And I want to thank you for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. This is a good podcast. And I tell you, it was a bonus finding out that you're a brother firefighter as well.
Yeah, I haven't done it in a long time though, so that's okay. Probably 15
Once
years ago.
But always a firefighter.
Yeah, we were extinguishing quite some fires actually. So yeah, and for now, for everybody, maybe fellow firefighters out there or anybody else listening, we just want to say bye-bye.
Have a good day. Thank you.
This was Supply Chain Pioneers. Thanks for watching, listening, or however you are enjoying this podcast. You can find Supply Chain Pioneers on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all other major podcast players, as well as on YouTube at Ulf Talk Supply Chain. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you next time.